Right now, though, we're going to go shift a little bit into Alzheimer's disease. I'm interested in this as well. I'm sure you all are. My hockey coach, when I was in high school, is the winningest high school hockey coach in the world, in America. And I'm glad to have played for him. He's a great one. But his wife now, who I've known for 50 years, has Alzheimer's. So I want to get her taken care of as quickly as we can. And let's see if Dr. Gary Wenk can help us figure out how to do that. Dr. Wenk, could you please come up here and speak to us? Thank you.
All right, thank you, the Patients Out of Time, and also Mary Lynn for the invitation. It's wonderful to come back to Tucson. I lived here for many years. As you all know now, it's a great place to visit. It's a wonderful place to live. And so it's great to come back. And I thank them for the opportunity to do so. This is a bit of a change from what you've been listening to so far, but I have a bit of an advantage in that most of you have already heard a lot about some of the basic principles that I'll be discussing in our studies of Alzheimer's disease. You're familiar with the chemistry of the cannabinoid system and the idea of animal models, and also the role of inflammation in ALS, Huntington's, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about the work that I've been doing now on Alzheimer's for the last 40 years, but in particular the last 25, because I've been focusing on the role of brain inflammation. And by now you've heard many times that cannabis is a wonderful anti-inflammatory drug. I initially spent most of my time trying to find experimental compounds that drug companies would give me because those had great potential for actually being placed into the marketplace. Obviously, that's not the case with this product. But let me introduce the model first, and then I'll get into the studies that we've done. First of all, we believe that chronic brain inflammation promotes Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't cause it, just as it doesn't cause ALS, it doesn't cause Parkinson's, but it's in the background. As you get older, inflammation just naturally develops and blossoms in your brain. There's no avoiding it as far as we can tell. But there are some lifestyle choices that people make that do affect whether it's there. And one of these is cannabinoids. For many, many years, we've seen that the incidence of Alzheimer's is going up, up, up. You've probably seen the numbers yourselves. We know that as the baby boomers reach a certain age, they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's. What's interesting, though, is that we're beginning to notice in the epidemiological evidence that the incidence of Alzheimer's in individuals who were smoking marijuana in the 1960s are not getting Alzheimer's today at the rate that they should be. They're sort of standing out. So if you were lucky enough to either be arthritic or someone who smoked marijuana and you were bathing your brain in anti-inflammatories, you were in lucky groups of people who did not get Alzheimer's disease. Now, we knew about arthritis for decades, but no one really noticed the effects of cannabinoid smoking until just recently, and we're beginning to follow up on that discovery. So why do we think this is a disease of inflammation? Because of epidemiological evidence such as this, where for people who use Tylenol, aspirin, or ibuprofen, and 1.0 is average. So what you can see is that if you were using ibuprofen for 2 years, now this is a lot of Advil. This is essentially 1,200 milligrams a day. Your stomach's going to hurt. You're going to lose a lot of GI blood, but if you have arthritis, what choice do you have? But what we found, as you can see, is that the number of people who were getting Alzheimer's was significantly reduced. But that's 2 years of GI bleeding and Advil. Aspirin, no benefits at all. Tylenol, nothing at all, because those drugs don't cross the blood-brain barrier. That's going to turn out to matter. Drugs that enter the brain can affect the brain. It seems almost too obvious to state, but it explains why ibuprofen works and Tylenol does not. If you look at the brain of an Alzheimer's patient, what you find is that inflammation is actually something that appears in the brain very early on. We now believe a person 40 years old who's going to get Alzheimer's 40 years later is showing the evidence of inflammation. And what you're looking at over here are these blue and green dots on both sides, is essentially the presence of inflammation in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient. Now, the inflammation is due to the presence of mutations, mutant proteins, head injury. If you've been hit in the head a lot, if you're a boxer, you're more likely to develop dementia. If you're in a severe car accident after the age of 55, When I was here at the University of Arizona teaching medical students, I did something blasphemous. I told them if they ever had a patient who was in a car accident and had severe head injury, the first thing they should tell that patient to do is start smoking marijuana heavily for the next 2 weeks because it would protect their brain. Some of them listened, most of them did not. But anyway. So what I do now, rat people never get applauses. Clinicians get applauses. I'm a rat guy. So anyway, what I'm studying are animal models of Alzheimer's disease. And the way we do this is by looking at young rats where we artificially induce chronic low-level brain inflammation. Or we take just old rats. Old rats, like old people, develop naturally occurring brain inflammation. And what we discovered after doing some behavioral testing, and you'll see some evidence of this, is that we can reproduce many of the important components of Alzheimer's. So what we do is we lower a cannula into the fourth ventricle. We infuse them with LPS, which is a component of the bacteria. It induces a whole bunch of chemicals. Some of these you've seen on people's slides, but these are inflammatory proteins. And one interesting thing happens. Red dots appear. Those are glutamate molecules. So what we've discovered is that in the presence of brain inflammation, there's a lot of glutamate. And you've already heard about glutamate mentioned as producing toxicity before. Now, what happens in the brain of our animals is that they get all these little black dots in areas of the brain. The black dots are activated microglia, the brain's immune system. And I'm going to be showing you that again because if you have a lot of these little microglia that are activated, the inflammation after periods of decades slowly banging away in your brain leads to the production of either Alzheimer's, if that's the gene you have, ALS, if that's the gene you have, Huntington's, Parkinson's. It depends on how you've lived your life. You may get inflammation in one part of the brain or another, but the takeaway point here is that inflammation develops. So our model is as follows, and again, you've just heard about WIN. WIN's our cannabinoid we're using. So what happens is that there are glutamate receptors and there are mutant proteins and there's inflammation and oxidative stress because of aging. It affects the health of mitochondria. That affects the glutamate receptors, and ultimately the receptors unblock themselves. Why doesn't matter. But the key thing here is that when glutamate binds, there is a burst of calcium that enters and continues to destroy the neurons. Now, to the rescue is WIN. Happy little molecule binds presynaptically, where you already know the cannabinoid receptors are located. And the consequence of that is that there's fewer glutamate being released. Less glutamate, less toxicity. Less toxicity, less inflammation. So WIN is a compound that acts like THC because it looks like THC. You can see this right here. Here's THC and here's WIN. Now, WIN was invented many years ago by a company named Winthrop that went out of business because they couldn't sell the product. You know why. But it is available, and we tested it, and it works beautifully to reduce brain inflammation. Here is the black dots, the activated microglia. This is after a very low dose of WIN and a somewhat higher dose of WIN. Now, what I want to point out to you is that we didn't know what dose to start with. So we decided, let's pick the lowest dose. Our guidance on this were the blogs from the ALS literature, the multiple sclerosis blogs. The people who have MS and ALS would talk about how 1 puff a day was enough to get benefits. So we scaled it down for a rat so that they were getting 1 puff a day. That's all. Now, 1 puff a day is not enough to get you high, although some of my undergraduates have been kind enough to go ahead and do that experiment for me, and took a lot of arm twisting. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, if you carry a lot of body fat, you will begin to notice the extra cannabinoid in your body. So 1 puff does build up. But for our animals, the effect was visible after only 1 puff a day equivalent. In the old rats, here's a normal old brain, lots of activated microglia after 1 puff a day for just 3 weeks. This is not a long-term change. This is an immediate effect. And I should point out that after 25 years of studying this model and testing literally 100 different drugs for drug companies, cannabis, or WIN in this case, but you'll see some other compounds in a moment, this is the only class of drugs that gets in the brain at such a low dose and actually can do this in an old brain. Everything works in a young brain. But we're not treating a disease associated with young people. This is a disease associated with the elderly. We needed to find something that worked in the old brain, and we did, and it was cannabis. So what you see here is actually some of the neurochemistry related to the reduction in pro-inflammatory cytokines, and you've heard about those already. But let me show you what happens behaviorally. I won't go through the task, but essentially on the ordinate is poor performance. And what you'll notice right away is the old guys who got the vehicle were quite stupid, and the young guys who got the vehicle were quite smart. And this is another point I want to make to you. If you are a young rat or a young human and you use just a little marijuana every day, you will see a short-term memory impairment. That's what we're looking at here, memory, over a period of 4 days. So a young rat is sort of like my young college students. They smoke marijuana, they have a short-term memory impairment. It goes away when the drug leaves the brain. But the old rats, quite different. So this is different between a young teenager and an elderly person with Alzheimer's, is that the old rats, when given 1 puff a day, got smarter. So now they're not as smart as a teenager, but they're going in the right direction. So the point I want you to take away from this is that it's never too late to start smoking marijuana, all right? What also surprised us is right here. One of the most amazing things that happens in aging that has fascinated us, and we didn't have a good explanation for until a few years ago, was neurogenesis, stem cells, the birth of new neurons. As you get older, the number of your young, these white dots, the number of neurogenesis cells, stem cells, goes to 0. So that by the time you're 60, 70, 80, you have no neurogenesis. It turns out that that correlates with depression. We know that depression happens often in people when they're older, and they have trouble with their memory when they're older. Those two things are related. If I give you a drug like Prozac, we actually make you less sad, and neurogenesis starts looking like it did when you were young again. One of the most shocking things that we found in this study is that 1 puff a day in our aged rats took here's a young rat. Here's an old rat, not on cannabis, and here, after only 3 weeks, we already restart neurogenesis. So we have every reason to believe that we might even be treating the depression tendency that happens in the elderly, the memory loss that happens in the elderly. You saw that in the previous slide that our rats got smarter. We reduce their brain inflammation, we restart neurogenesis, and we may be helping them on a number of levels. So the question, though, is how do you do this? And my colleagues who like marijuana don't like this statement, but how do you do this without generating a high? It doesn't do any good to an Alzheimer's patient to take them when they already have mild cognitive impairment and then make them high. You're making the cognitive function worse. But at 1 puff a day, we're hoping that that won't produce that effect. So what we've done in my laboratory over the past couple of years is we've started to systematically focus on the synapse that you've seen many times. So we're looking at whether or not we can stimulate CB1 or CB2 receptors. Now, we find CB2 receptors in the brain, in this part of the brain, or we block reuptake. This is sort of like the Prozac effect, where we allow the brain to release its own endogenous cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids that Dr. DiMarzo talked about, but we prevent them from being removed from the synapse, sort of like the way Prozac does for serotonin. Or we inhibit the enzyme Fa, which you just heard about, and for many others, which is catabolizing the marijuana once it's produced. Or, finally, all that extra glutamate that I pointed out in the earlier cartoon, we've been using the drug that's available for Alzheimer's disease today, memantine, also known as Namenda. And so we've compared all of these now. This took years and lots of different animal studies, but this is all looking at naturally occurring inflammation in aged animals. So which one of these approaches works? That was the question, because obviously marijuana is only acting here, not affecting reuptake of the enzyme or NMDA channels. So it turns out that all of these things actually worked exceptionally well except one, the inhibition of Fa. Now, after we gave this compound, the URB compound, endocannabinoid levels did go up, but apparently they didn't go up enough. And the problem is timing. If you prevent catabolism, the levels just build, and you get desensitization, which you heard about yesterday. But if you block reuptake, it's better, because then you only take advantage of when the brain wants endocannabinoid release, we just enhance that natural release. That seemed to have a far more effective, and beneficial effect. So our theory is that the way to approach this is to not stimulate cannabinoid receptors exogenously the way marijuana does, but rather to use compounds that block reuptake, sort of the Prozac effect. So take advantage of our newfound knowledge. Because when I try and find NIH funding for these studies, you've already heard, it doesn't exist. When I have news reporters come to my lab to interview us, they want to talk to us about our caffeine research. We're also looking at caffeine. It turns out that 5 cups a day of coffee is almost as good as a puff a day of marijuana. Not as good, but in that direction, all right? So what we just heard, this young woman telling us that she drinks coffee with her marijuana in the morning, there couldn't be a better morning breakfast for the brain. So, having said, my students really appreciate these lectures. So, the other thing I encourage my students to do is eat Twinkies, and we have a reason for that too, but their parents hate me. But anyway, this is a study looking at marijuana, actually a marijuana agonist in mice. These are transgenic mice, and what they're finding is the use of glucose by the mouse model of Alzheimer's disease is also coming back to normal. That what we find that as they're consuming a synthetic cannabinoid, in this case for 4 months, they just pick these things arbitrarily. We never know. You just have to guess. But what they found was that glucose utilization is coming back to normal in these transgenic mice. So there's many promising indicators that tell us, you know what, there's something interesting going on here. It can be targeted with very low doses of cannabinoids. It can be enhanced with other anti-inflammatory drugs such as estrogen or caffeine. Especially, so if you're thinking of going into menopause, start smoking dope. If you're thinking of just getting older and you're a man and you can't borrow an ovary, then you pretty much, marijuana is a great approach. Marijuana has a lot of estrogenic properties. We all remember in high school the guy who developed the man boobs, right? So we can see the consequences of cannabinoids on many systems. We're now finally beginning to unpack the neurochemistry of what it's doing by using these animal models. If you're interested in reading about this, and we've all been encouraged to provide you with references, these are some of the studies that we published recently looking at cannabinoid therapies in old animals, young animals, and looking at the epidemiology. And what we find is what you see this lovely lady here doing is that the cannabinoid receptors in the brain do not seem to disappear significantly. When I look in our aged animals, they're still there. That means that you're never too old to take this brain-penetrating, powerful, estrogenic, anti-inflammatory, neurogenic stimulus to compensate for the changes that are happening in your brain naturally. All right. Right here at the bottom, if you want you all that have that in your notes. If you want to go to that website, you can download PDFs of these papers, and if you have questions, you can always write to me as well. So low doses are effective. That's the take-home point. We've heard people talk about where they may need they have a full joint during the day. That may not be necessary. At the moment, what I'm trying to do is find new ways to avoid the psychoactive stimulant effects at very, very low doses of these compounds so that people will not be frightened to try them, that they won't be worried about impairing their cognitive function by being somewhat high, which scares people when they get older. We know the focus is on glutamate because we see that cannabinoids themselves do not affect glutamate receptors, but indirectly they can prevent neurotoxicity, and we think that's how they prevent or restore neurogenesis. Stimulating the receptors directly works. This is why we think the epidemiology for cancer is so positive, the things you've already heard from numerous other authors. Preventing reuptake, though, may end up being more effective and may circumvent the issue of the high, so that we can let the patient have neuroprotection without interfering with their cognitive status. So maybe one day we'll see these SERIs instead of SSRIs appear on the market. Right? That's our hope. Now, because of the research in my lab, this is our lab T-shirt. A puff is enough. They're not on sale anywhere, but should you decide to make your own. And I want to thank the individuals who helped me with this, my graduate student, Holly Brothers, postdoctoral fellow, Yannick Marchalant, who's now back in France at the University of Marseille, and my other postdoc, Francesca Cerbai, who's now back at the University of Florence. They were essential in allowing me to conduct these studies. And so I thank you for your attention.